von den Angeklagten, soweit sie in meinem Blickfeld lagen, die ersten militärischen Berater Hitlers.
When investigators stepped inside Friedrich Paulus's Dresden mansion after his death, they expected old war medals and dusty maps. Instead, what they found sent shock waves through intelligence circles. Hidden rooms, sealed letters, and mysterious files hinted at a story far darker than anyone imagined. The Stasi locked it away. The Soviets erased the records. And for decades, no one dared to ask why. But new details have resurfaced. And what they suggest could change everything we thought we knew about the man who surrendered at Stalingrad. This is the untold truth behind what they found in Friedrich Paulus's mansion after his death. The fall of the Field Marshal. The winter of 1943 was a graveyard of steel and silence. The once proud Sixth Army, trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, had become a living monument to defeat. Thousands of soldiers froze in cellars or starved in the snow while artillery shells fell like judgment from above. At the center of it all stood a man who had once been the symbol of German precision and discipline, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. Until that moment, Paulus's rise through the ranks of the Wehrmacht had been defined by order and control. He was a staff officer, a strategist, a man of tidy reports and calculated movements. But Stalingrad was chaos, and no amount of planning could restore what the Eastern Front had become. The encirclement by Soviet forces cut off supplies, hope, and communication. Still, Hitler demanded that Paulus hold the city at all costs. And as the temperature fell below zero, those costs became unthinkable. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a title meant to carry a dark message. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear: die with honor or die a coward. But Paulus, gaunt and exhausted, refused to end his life for a dictator he had begun to doubt. The next day, he surrendered to the Red Army. When the news reached Berlin, it was treated as treason. But to those who saw Paulus's haunted eyes as he stepped out of the rubble, it was not betrayal, it was survival. He became the highest-ranking German officer ever captured alive. What no one knew then was that his decision would not only change his own fate but also set in motion a sequence of events that would follow him for the rest of his life, all the way to a quiet street in Dresden. The Soviets recognized his value immediately. He was not just a prisoner, he was an opportunity. They studied him, questioned him, fed him information, and waited for him to break. And over the years of captivity that followed, something inside Paulus shifted. By the time he appeared at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, testifying against his former comrades, the transformation was complete. The once loyal servant of Hitler's army now spoke as a witness for the Allies. His voice was calm, but his words were devastating. That I will speak the pure truth and will withhold and add nothing. It was as if Stalingrad had shattered not just his army but his entire belief system. Yet even then, whispers surrounded him. Some said he had been re-educated, others that he was merely playing a role to stay alive. His years in the Soviet Union were marked by a strange duality: privileged captivity under close watch. He was housed comfortably, guarded politely, and kept away from the public eye. The Soviets wanted him alive but silent, useful but contained. By the early 1950s, when Stalin's death shifted the tides of policy, Paulus was finally allowed to return to German soil. But it wasn't the Germany he had known. He was sent to East Germany, to the city of Dresden, still scarred by fire and war. The authorities gave him a villa on Preußstraße overlooking the Elbe. To the world, it looked like a gesture of respect. To those who understood the politics of the time, it was more like a gilded cage. The Stasi watched him closely, recording who visited and what was said. Former officers avoided him. Loyalists called him a traitor, and Western observers wondered what he might be hiding. Inside that grand villa, surrounded by microphones and suspicion, Friedrich Paulus lived out his final years as both symbol and shadow of Germany's collapse. What he left behind after his death in 1957 would take years to come to light. And when the officials entered his house, they found more than personal belongings and old military documents. They found traces of a life that had become entangled with the secrets of two regimes and a mystery that, even decades later, continues to whisper from the quiet walls of his Dresden mansion. Unofficially, he was a prisoner in plain sight. Inside the villa, the walls themselves seemed to keep secrets. The rooms were large but sparsely furnished, with a few Soviet gifts on display, a ceremonial saber, a portrait of Stalin, and a small model of Stalingrad sent by a Russian officer. Paulus's personal belongings were few: military documents, books, and notes he guarded closely. He had a small study on the upper floor overlooking the river where he spent hours writing letters that were rarely sent. The Stasi files later revealed that they monitored not just his calls and visitors, but also his conversations at home. Microphones had been hidden in lamps and furniture. Agents were stationed nearby around the clock, and a coded log was kept of every visitor who entered or left the premises. "Object terrace is secure," one report stated dryly, as if describing a fortress rather than the home of an aging man who had already surrendered everything. Despite the restrictions, Paulus remained outwardly calm. Those few who spoke with him in his final years described a man still burdened by guilt but determined to appear composed. He read military history, collected maps, and corresponded with former colleagues in cautious, filtered letters. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window with the lights off, watching the city fade into darkness. What he thought about in those moments remains unknown. Some say he felt remorse, others that he feared retribution. There were whispers circulating among East German officers that Paulus had hidden personal notes and wartime records within the villa's walls. A few even believed he had been keeping private correspondence with Soviet officers, letters that contradicted the official narrative of his conversion. When he died in February 1957, the announcement came quietly, almost like an administrative update. The East German government issued a short statement praising his commitment to peace and held a modest funeral under Soviet supervision. But the Stasi didn't close the file. They entered the villa soon after, sealed the rooms, and conducted a detailed search. What they found there was never fully disclosed. Years later, when archives opened briefly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, fragments of those inventories surfaced: lists of documents, sealed envelopes, and one curious note: material withheld for state evaluation. Whatever that meant, it hinted that Paulus's life in Dresden had not been as quiet as it seemed. And for those who later studied his case, one question kept resurfacing: what exactly had been left behind in that silent villa on Preußstraße 10? The locked room. In the weeks following Friedrich Paulus's death in February 1957, Dresden moved on quietly. The obituary in East German newspapers was short, respectful, and dry. It spoke of a man who had embraced peace and renounced the errors of fascism. There was no mention of his capture, no mention of Stalingrad, and certainly no mention of the surveillance that had surrounded him for the last 4 years of his life. The villa on Preußstraße 10 was sealed almost immediately, and for months, no one outside the Ministry of State Security was allowed to enter. But that silence didn't last. By late spring, a small group of Stasi officers arrived under the pretext of cataloging his belongings for state archives. Officially, their task was simple: document his personal effects and prepare the property for reassignment. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. The order, according to later accounts, came from higher up. They were to search the house thoroughly and recover any materials of ideological or political value. The phrasing was vague, which in the world of East German intelligence meant one thing: they were looking for secrets. When the agents began their work, the villa seemed unremarkable. The study was neat, the shelves filled with history books, maps, and old Soviet gifts. But in the back of the upstairs study, behind a tall bookshelf, they found something that caught their attention: a narrow locked door hidden behind a sliding panel. The hinges were old, and the keyhole had been filled with wax. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the smell of paper and dust. What they uncovered would later become the subject of quiet speculation in intelligence circles. Stacked in that concealed room were boxes of handwritten notes, maps, and sealed envelopes bearing Soviet insignia. Some documents were marked with the year 1945, others later. There were files on German officers who had surrendered at Stalingrad and letters written in Paulus's careful hand, some addressed to Soviet officials, others to his family. A few were drafts of speeches never delivered. One of them, curiously, was a statement denouncing both Hitler and Stalin. According to reports that surfaced years later, one Stasi officer described the discovery as a politically sensitive collection. Another referred to it simply as Das Vermächtnis des Feldmarschalls, the Field Marshal's papers. The materials were quickly confiscated, sealed, and transferred to a restricted section of the archives in Berlin. None of it was ever made public. But what made the find truly shocking were the rumors that followed. Some claimed the documents contained evidence that Paulus had continued to correspond with Soviet generals in secret, discussing the war's final months in ways that contradicted official Soviet accounts. Others whispered that he had kept copies of his interrogations along with personal reflections, suggesting he no longer believed the version of events he was forced to endorse publicly. A few even suggested that the hidden room contained photographs and coded notes linking Soviet officers to wartime atrocities the regime preferred forgotten. Whatever the truth, the discovery was enough to send quiet ripples through East German intelligence. The official inventory was redacted, the officers who handled the materials reassigned, and within weeks, all references to the Paulus file disappeared from Stasi records. Only a handful of insiders were said to have read the full contents, and their reports were stored under classified headings that remain sealed to this day. Years later, when the archives of the German Democratic Republic began to open, historians found references to withheld personal material of exceptional state relevance dated 1957, the same year Paulus died. The original documents have never been released, fueling decades of speculation. So when people ask what really happened inside that house, there's only one answer historians can give with certainty. Here's what they found in Friedrich Paulus's mansion after his death that left the world shocked: a hidden room, sealed letters, and records that no one was ever supposed to read. To this day, no one outside the archives knows their full content. But the fact that the Stasi kept it buried for decades suggests one thing: whatever Paulus left behind, this is unbelievable. For a man who once surrendered an entire army, perhaps his final act was surrendering his truth to history itself. And if the rumors are even half correct, the villa on Preußstraße was more than a retirement home. It was the final battlefield of a conscience court between two empires. Theories and the silence. The official story was that the Stasi found nothing of consequence in the villa, only documents of personal relevance. But few in Dresden ever believed that. The secrecy surrounding the search, the sealed reports, and the quiet transfer of boxes to Berlin all hinted at something larger. In East Germany, silence often meant importance, and in the case of Friedrich Paulus, it meant danger. Over the years, fragments of information trickled out, never from the government, but from those who claimed to have seen the files before they vanished. Some described notes that contradicted Soviet wartime accounts, implying Paulus had written privately about Stalin's tactical blunders at Stalingrad. Others mentioned coded correspondence with German officers held in captivity, discussing the conditions of their interrogations. And there were whispers that one envelope marked not to be opened contained the names of German and Soviet officers who had conspired during the war's final collapse. Of course, no one could prove any of it. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, historians rushed to examine the archives of the Stasi and East German ministries. Boxes from the 1950s were opened, revealing thousands of documents on surveillance, propaganda, and Cold War espionage, but nothing bearing Paulus's name. His file number appeared in indexes, but the corresponding materials were gone. Some claimed they had been transferred to Moscow. Others believed they were destroyed long before reunification. The missing documents became the center of competing theories. One camp argued that Paulus had been compiling a secret memoir, revealing details that embarrassed both sides. Another insisted that he had hidden sensitive Soviet files entrusted to him during captivity, and that their discovery in Dresden triggered a quiet diplomatic scramble. A third, more skeptical view held that the so-called shocking discovery was nothing more than propaganda, an inflated story built on half-truths and hearsay. Whatever the case, the East German authorities never spoke publicly about it again. The villa was eventually sold to private owners, the Stasi reports locked away, and the name Object Terrorist removed from official records. Yet one question still lingers, whispered by historians who study that era. If there was truly nothing to hide, Why erase all trace of it? Because in the world Paulus inhabited, the real power was never in what was said, but in what was quietly buried. Legacy of a haunted villa. Today, the villa on Preußstraße 10 still stands, a stately cream-colored house tucked behind tall trees overlooking the Elbe. The iron gates are closed to visitors, and there are no plaques or signs marking it as the former home of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. To passers-by, it's just another piece of Dresden's restored beauty. But for those who know its story, it's more than that. It's a monument to silence. After the reunification of Germany, historians and journalists tried to trace what happened inside those walls in 1957. Some knocked on doors, others combed through archives, but each search ended in the same place, a gap in the record. The Stasi files that might have explained everything were either missing or labeled as destroyed. The few surviving reports hinted at sensitive materials withheld for state evaluation, but offered nothing else. It was as if an entire chapter of his life had been deliberately erased. Residents who lived nearby after the war recalled seeing officials coming and going for weeks after Paulus's death. They spoke of vans arriving at night, of men carrying out heavy boxes, and of guards posted at the gate long after the body had been taken away. No one asked questions then. In East Germany, questions could be dangerous. But decades later, those same neighbors admitted they always felt something unsettling about that house. What makes the story even stranger is that nothing from the so-called Paulus collection ever surfaced. Not in German archives, not in Moscow, not even in fragments. Historians believe the missing documents could have included his private reflections on both Hitler and Stalin, potentially explosive material during the Cold War. If so, their disappearance was no accident. And yet, perhaps the real mystery isn't what was taken from the house, but what was left behind. The walls of the villa, once covered with microphones and secret cameras, now belong to ordinary residents. They live among rooms that once held a man haunted by 2 regimes, 2 betrayals, and an unfinished confession. Friedrich Paulus died believing he could at least control the end of his own story. But history had other plans. His name remains bound to Stalingrad, his conscience buried in secrecy, and his home remembered as the place where truth went quiet. Whatever was found or hidden inside that mansion, one thing is certain: the silence that followed it still echoes through Dresden's hills. What could have been so dangerous inside Paulus's hidden room that both East Germany and the Soviets buried it for decades? Let us know in the comments.